You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, we have some pretty big news here. Mike Pence has been subpoenaed by Jack Smith, the special counsel overseeing the January 6th investigation. Now, in what way could this be most damaging to Trump? Like, what information could Jack Smith seek that could hurt Trump the most?
So one thing that we know is that Donald Trump waged a relentless pressure campaign against Mike Pence. Primarily, what he was trying to accomplish was he was trying to convince Mike Pence to violate the law, the Electoral Count Act, to refuse to certify Joe Biden's win as at least a step on the road to having Donald Trump installed corruptly for a second term. So he was urging Mike Pence to break a law. And when you urge a government official to violate a federal law, you are involved in criminal activity yourself. It is an attempt to violate the law. Every crime that's on the books also has a crime attached to it, attempt to commit that crime. That's just one example. But because Jack Smith is now as close as he can get to the president, the vice president has been served a grand jury subpoena to testify in the criminal investigation into Donald Trump's responsibility for the insurrection. This is actually a pretty big deal. And it feels like this may be the last stop on the road to a Trump indictment.
Okay, so in general, what do you think that Pence will be asked? Like, what information could he give? Even notwithstanding just like what could be most damaging, but what do you think the information that is going to be requested of him by Jack Smith is going to be?
You know, it is going to be, I suspect, a far-reaching grand jury line of inquiry. You know, when we put somebody in the grand jury and we believe they have a lot of information relevant to our criminal probe, we have a saying for it as prosecutors: we are going to wear them out in the grand jury. We are going to probe every nook and cranny of information that a witness has about the target of our criminal investigation. So, you know, Jack Smith, I'm convinced, will leave sort of no factual stone unturned. He'll want to know about the fake electors. He'll want to know about John Eastman, Donald Trump's corrupt lawyer, who happens to be a co-conspirator of Donald Trump's in this fraudulent attempt to overturn the election's results. That's not my take. That's the take of a federal judge in California who ruled by a preponderance of the evidence that Donald Trump and John Eastman committed at least 2 felony crimes together. He'll want to know, I think, primarily about everything Donald Trump did to try to get Mike Pence to do the wrong thing. And I think it's really important for people to remember. Mike Pence went from a potential co-conspirator with Donald Trump, because had he gone along with Donald Trump's corrupt scheme, had he succumbed to Donald Trump's pressure, then he would have been a co-conspirator and he could have been looking at an indictment himself. But he didn't. Now, look, he's no hero. All he did was obey the law. All he did was refuse to commit the crimes Donald Trump was urging him to commit. But, you know, at least he did certify the election's results. And at that point, when it became clear to Donald Trump that Mike Pence was not going to help him do his dirty bidding, Mike Pence went from a potential co-conspirator with Donald Trump to one of Donald Trump's victims, because we will never forget the chants from the insurrectionists, Donald Trump's angry mob, hang Mike Pence, which were inspired by Donald Trump's tweet saying Mike Pence didn't have the courage to stand up and do what he should have done. In other words, to corruptly throw the election to Donald Trump. That converted Mike Pence from potential co-conspirator to victim. And here's the thing: Mike Pence, in either one of those capacities, is somebody that the special counsel will need to interview. And it looks like now special counsel Jack Smith has taken that concrete step by serving him with a subpoena.
In fairness, what's going to be Trump's defense here? And does he actually have a defense here?
Donald Trump has no viable defense, which Brian, is one of the reasons that this is so maddening to this old prosecutor. I have maintained all along, the more we see publicly reported about what Donald Trump did, I've maintained all along that really the only impediment to a Donald Trump conviction is not the evidence, is not the proof of his corrupt intent. It's an indictment.
Yeah.
So we can get a prosecutor into a courtroom standing in front of 12 people in a jury box arguing this case. Once we're there, I contend it is a very strong case on the evidence. So Donald Trump will have no viable defense, in my opinion. He can say, I didn't have criminal intent. Has Donald Trump's intent ever been demonstrably pure, right? Not corrupt? His own officials and his own executive branch agencies told him over and over and over again, you didn't win, you lost. The election wasn't rigged. There was no systemic fraud undermining the election's results. Donald Trump cannot possibly persuade a jury that he didn't know he lost, and that proves his intent was corrupt. So at the end of the day, he doesn't have a defense. That's why we've got to get this case into court.
Now, we've spoken about this before, but does watching this investigation ramp up signal that an indictment is more and more likely, in that the special counsel wouldn't dedicate all of these resources into moving full steam ahead and bringing a witness in front of the special grand jury like Mike Pence if there wasn't a reason for all of this?
Yeah, let me start by saying when prosecutors are investigating a case, you investigate it thoroughly and aggressively, and you only sort of reach a conclusion about whether or not to bring a charge, whether or not to indict somebody sort of toward the end of the investigation. So an indictment is not a sure thing just because Mike Pence has been subpoenaed. But the fact that Mike Pence has been subpoenaed, I think, ups the ante significantly, that Jack Smith believes that what he's got is pointing in the direction of an indictment. And this is probably one of the last and most important bases he has to touch. Getting Mike Pence under oath with a full, truthful, sworn account of what he knows Donald Trump to have done. So I'll tell you, if I were a betting man, I would say the odds just shot up that we're going to see a Donald Trump indictment.
Now, is Mike Pence the highest profile figure to cooperate with Jack Smith, assuming he does cooperate? And kind of as a follow-up to that, is anybody higher needed who hasn't yet cooperated with Jack Smith in special counsel investigation?
So cooperation is a tricky subject because just because we know somebody has been subpoenaed to the grand jury doesn't mean they cooperated in the grand jury, because non-cooperation can take a number of forms that we wouldn't necessarily know about because grand jury proceedings are secret. One form non-cooperation could take is witnesses who are subpoenaed to go before the grand jury can assert all kinds of privileges, whether legitimate privileges or bogus privileges, attorney-client privilege, executive privilege regarding confidential communications between the witness and the president. Now, here's the good news. All of these privileges will yield if there is crime going on, courtesy of what's called the crime fraud exception. But this litigation could be ongoing if witnesses assert these privileges, because they have to be litigated behind closed doors, and a court has to rule, no, the privilege yields, such that the witness is then ordered, compelled by the judge to testify. That could be going on. Here's another form that non-cooperation might take. This may not be a shock to people, but not everybody that we put before the grand jury tells the truth. Some will mumble and fumble and deflect and hide and deceive and misdirect, and we never do get a truthful story out of them. That's a form of non-cooperation. I put witnesses like that before the grand jury, and I'll tell you what I did. If I caught them in those lies and I could prove they committed perjury, then that gave me leverage, because then my next step was I would talk to the witness together with his or her attorney and say, well, now you've got even bigger problems, because I'm about to ask the grand jury to indict you for perjury and obstruction of justice, and after the fact, courtesy of your lies about the target of my investigation, now you want to go back in and do something that we call cure the perjury by going in and testifying truthfully. If you do that, well, then I might not ask the grand jury to indict you for perjury, obstruction, and accessory after the fact. So there's always more than one way to skin a cat when you're involved in a grand jury proceeding where you have a really reluctant witness, somebody who's not willing to tell the complete truth.
Based on what you know about this, do you think there's a world in which Mike Pence doesn't comply, or is the fact that he's being subpoenaed and the fact that we know that there's been some degree of communication between the special counsel and Mike Pence's team, does that pretty much show us that it's a sure thing that he's going to show up after having received the subpoena?
I think Mike Pence complies with this subpoena. Remember, he, in what I would call cowardly fashion, said, I'm not going to testify before the January 6th committee. And the January 6th committee subpoenas really don't have a vehicle for sort of a robust enforcement mechanism. And Mike Pence knew that. I think it was a cop-out. I think it was unpatriotic and frankly un-American for Mike Pence to conceal from the January 6th committee, and by extension, conceal from the American people, the information he knew about Donald Trump's crimes, but he tried to spin it as well. The J6 committee is partisan and it's political, and I'm not inclined to cooperate with them. Mike Pence knows full well he has to cooperate with a grand jury subpoena. And let me add one thing, a bit of a twist. You know, Mike Pence could have reached out through his lawyers to Jack Smith's team, and he could have said, listen, you might want to hear from me. You might want me to come in for a voluntary interview, but I need the cover of a subpoena, because a subpoena is a court order directing that you appear before the grand jury and testify. And Mike Pence can use that as a bit of a shield against criticism that, hey, you're turning on the president. He could say, look, I got a subpoena. That's a lawful court order directing me to testify. I had no choice. I encountered that many times as a prosecutor, where witnesses would say, you know what, make sure you serve me with a subpoena because that gives me legal cover. And it doesn't make it look like I'm really enthusiastic about giving up my friends or my associates or the target of this criminal probe.
And it is, by the way, important for Mike Pence to save face because he's running for president, most likely, and you know, his prospects are high over there in that party that wanted to have him hanged. So we'll see what happens on that front. But with that said, will there be a need for Trump to testify, and is that something that Jack Smith could mandate if he felt that it was necessary?
Yeah, that's a great question. The next logical step would seem to be, okay, you've subpoenaed the former vice president. Now, isn't it going to be time to subpoena the president? The answer is no. Why is the answer no? Because ordinarily, we don't subpoena, prosecutors don't subpoena the target of the grand jury investigation, the person we intend to indict. And there's a simple reason for that. The target of a grand jury investigation has a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Heck, that's the person we're intending to indict for his crimes. So it would be sort of a futile exercise to indict the target of the investigation, who could simply waltz in and say, I plead the Fifth. Now, there might be some PR advantage to that. We have all seen Donald Trump now plead the Fifth, and it's pretty ugly, right? Yeah. But prosecutors can't really do it for PR advantage. So whereas the Department of Justice policy says we can, with approval, under certain circumstances, subpoena a target of an investigation, we almost never do.
Right. I guess the whole point is just to let the actual charge, the actual conviction play out, as opposed to bringing him in for this part. I mean, that's what the whole point of the trial is going to be. So one last question here. And what is the timeline now that we know that Mike Pence is being subpoenaed by Jack Smith?
So the open question is, will Mike Pence try to challenge this subpoena in court in any way? If he does, then I am afraid it's going to take some time to work its way through the process. Real quickly, the process will be, first, he will litigate it in front of the chief judge of the federal district court in Washington, D.C., Beryl Howell, because she has supervisory responsibility over the grand jury, assuming Judge Howell orders him to testify, says you have no viable privilege, and if you did, it yields to the crime fraud exception. Mike Pence could then appeal that to the District of Columbia Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. They would have to decide the issue, and then in theory, he could take it up to the Supreme Court. I am hoping that the courts have learned their lesson, that they don't let a litigant run out the clock or build tons of delay into this most significant process. and that it all gets resolved pretty quickly. Here's what I'll predict, Brian. I don't think Mike Pence takes this all the way up to the Supreme Court. I think if he wants to make a show of putting up some resistance and he wants to litigate the viability of a privilege he might want to use to get out of testifying, he may go to Chief Judge Beryl Howell, and she will almost undoubtedly order him to testify. Maybe he appeals it to the DC Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. Maybe he doesn't. I don't think he makes a show of going all the way up to the Supreme Court, because with every appeal he takes,
draws more attention to it.
Every bit of resistance he tries to throw up there, what is he doing?
Yeah,
He's sending the signal that I'm trying to hide the crimes of Donald Trump. That's pretty darn un-American.
Yeah, well, wouldn't be the first time they trafficked in that. So we'll continue to follow this stuff. For anybody watching, if you want to keep up on legal news, make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.